This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
This is the Talking Animal Law podcast, brought to you every 2 weeks by the UK Centre for Animal Law and hosted by Paula Sparks, Director of A-Law. But it's not just for lawyers, it's for anyone who cares about animals. So no matter who you are, if you want to know more about animal protection, news, ethics and animal law reform, then this is the podcast for you.
Hello, welcome to this episode of the Talking Animal Law podcast. We're joined today by Hilda Keane, who is a British historian specialising in public and cultural history, in particular the cultural history of animals. She's the former Dean and Director of Public History at Ruskin College, Oxford, where she taught history for many years. She's the author of a number of books, including Animal Rights, Politics and Social Change in Britain since 1800, and The Great Cat and Dog Massacre, the real story of World War II's unknown tragedy, and she's co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Animal-Human History. As we approach the bicentenary anniversary of Martin's Act of 1822, that's the world's first national animal protection legislation, we're talking to Hilda about the landscape in the 19th century Britain for human-animal relationships. Hilda, hello, thank you for joining us today for this episode.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, so you're coming to talk to us today to give us some historical context on issues that we've been talking about, particularly coming up to the anniversary of Martin's Act. So I just wanted to ask you what life was like in the early 1800s, Britain for animals and people. Can you provide a snapshot of human-animal relationships around this era?
Well, in a way, they were going on in lots of places. So, for example, in some rural areas, shepherds lived for parts of the year with their sheep and were often inseparable from their dogs. Horsemen helped the condition of horses, and even pigs were sometimes treated as family members.
Oh.
But by 1801, there was already a human presence of over 1 million people in London, alongside an abundance of animals, including sheep, goats, cattle, horses, in both the Smithfield cattle market and the growing transport industry. So that would mean that cattle were taken through London to the market, derived or devised away from water, food and rest, and beaten towards their slaughter.
Oh.
And they were therefore seen by many people, and they were also recorded in etchings in The Animal's Friend and The Voice of Humanity. So it's not quite so much that they coexisted as such, since the cattle, and this would continue even after the passing of the 1822 Act, were still going to market and were then going to be killed. So it's an ambiguous setting.
Mm. And I understand around that time, there were also practices such as cockfighting, bear baiting and bull baiting as forms of entertainment. Were these really popular pastimes during this era? Were there attempts to ban these practices?
No, you're right to say that there were many practices, and these were taking place positively and negatively and around the law before the 1822 Act. So this included Sir William Pulteney, and he was seeking the first law to prevent the barbaric practice of bull baiting. And here a bull was attacked by dogs, and it would be usually bulldogs bred for that purpose. There was a vote against it, but being lost by just 41 to 43 votes. But behind the law, Pulteney had linked it in to drunkenness and saying people stayed away from work to do it, and it was a popular pastime. And it was then seen at that time as an act of the lower class. However, other politicians thought differently. So William Wyndham, he did defend bull baiting. And he saw those that were against it, such as the London Corresponding Society or Methodists. He said he wanted to keep everything joyous. And what they did, they were promoting their own, what he called fanatical doctrines. So he also argued that bull baiting was particularly popular in Lancashire and Staffordshire, saying that those counties were known to produce the best soldiers for the army. And even in 1829, bull baiting was not carried, and it needed to continue until the 1830s legislation. And still, even beyond that time, in Staffordshire in Lincolnshire, it existed until 1840, but did very much have the influence there of the RSPCA campaigning against it. So these brutal sports towards animals were not really confined just to working men. These went cross class. So the aristocracy was focused on cockfighting, particularly with the Earl of Derby, keeping 3,000 cocks for fighting. And there were also pits at Westminster. And again, despite the change of law in the 1830s, this still continued in sporting taverns in London, including dog and also rat killing. And often this was illustrated, frequently of Billy, the famous dog, killing rats. And it was also described in Henry Mayhew's accounts.
Oh gosh, so as you say, quite an ambiguous picture, and interesting to hear about the issues around class as well,
Yes,
connected to that actually.
Yeah.
What about Richard Martin himself, the sponsor of the bill, Richard Martin MP? What can you tell us about him?
Well, he was seen in various ways. So he was from Ireland, in Galway, and when elected to Parliament, he did speak up for Catholic emancipation. He opposed slavery, and he attempted to abolish death for forgery. But regarding the cruel sports against animals, he said he was opposed to the rich as well as the poor, saying in Parliament that he was equally anxious to meddle with both when he found them opposed to the dictates of humanity. Now, to be honest, he wasn't always praised. Some MPs pointed to what they saw as hypocrisy, saying Richard Martin had sympathised so much with the sufferings of dogs and cats, but had apparently voted for the torture of the lash on 73,000 British soldiers. And rather ironically, William Cobbett, as a campaigner for progressive legislation, compared the passing of laws to regulate the evils of the factories, suggesting that Mr. Martin of Galway has procured Acts of Parliament to be passed to prevent cruelty to animals. If horses or dogs were shut up in a place like this, a factory with excessive heat, they would certainly be thought worthy of St. Martin's attention.
Oh, interesting argument. So how did his attempts go to get a law passed to protect animals from cruel treatment, and resulting in Martin's Act, as we know, in 1822? How was that received?
Well, it wasn't a one-off, that has to be stressed. Before that, there were many failed acts that were raised, and another key person behind that would be Lord Erskine. Right. And in 1809, Lord Thomas Erskine, he had previously supported Thomas Paine's work, The Rights of Man. He'd been in favour of abolishing slavery, and he had argued for the protection of animals. He said, beneath us, to reflect back our sympathies to one another. He also had been critical of cockfighting and bear baiting, as well as the indolent rich, his words, galloping over our roads for neither good nor evil, but to fill up the dreary blank in unoccupied life. And what he'd argued then in 1809 was for a cruelty to animals bill that was actually approved by the House of Lords, but defeated in the Commons. And while he focused on cruelty to farm animals and pets, his argument was more general. His aim was to apply the law to every animal which comes in contact with man, which is quite significant, I think, and their role. And he said, they are created indeed for our use, but not for our abuse. And his focus was upon a catalogue of protected animals. So although references are often made to his support in Parliament for horses and against bull baiting, his argument was directed more generally against what he said, the inhuman cruelties practiced upon animals. So therefore animals of whatever named group were thus becoming a presence in legislation. So there were these early attempts until May the 24th, 1822, when Parliament approved it and then royal assent. So it's at that point it became an offence for any person or persons wantonly and cruelly too. And I'll read these out deliberately because it's what then happens next. To beat, abuse or ill-treat any horse, mare, gelding, mule, ass, ox, cow, heifer, steer, sheep or other cattle. So as I've subsequently now noted, the law then needed further changes because there were other things needed. Even at the time, Thomas Fowle Buxton, the MP for Weymouth, said the Act had put an end to half the cruelty which formerly prevailed in the country, yet the instances of cruelty to animals were numerous, acknowledging that the sufferings of dogs and cats continued. And it's very much that phrase that made me also then start to think about it, because it wasn't just me thinking about ordinary animals, it was people at the time looking at what was missing from that legislation, but recognizing the cruelty to domestic animals and needing to have changes for them.
And what about enforcement? How was Martin's Act enforced?
Well, as a lawyer, you might read it differently to me, but I found it quite interesting because I think the coverage of it would include, for example, Richard Martin himself, who was taking men to court for beating horses at Smithfield Market. And as another example, Lord Erskine, he was beating a carter who was ill-treating a horse in Coventry Street in central London. So it's not that the law was just passed, but it wasn't just the state alone that was almost implementing it. And so what also began to emerge was awareness of a cruelty that was being practiced, not just towards rural and transport animals, but also those seen as domestic animals, cats and dogs. And one of the things I've considered is not just looking at the law or the SPCA, but there were also visual things going on and written work. So after that law was passed, one of the things that appeared, which might sound odd, is the work of Edwin Landseer and a painting called The Cat's Paw, a controversial painting in 1824, which involves a cat being attacked by a monkey. And another one is a Jack called A Jack in Office, painted in the early 1830s, and it depicts the virtual employment of a dog by a human. The human's creating animal food, and he's on a barrow standing there. And what the dog isn't doing is passing on food freely to impoverished dogs. And for example, those two paintings do actually raise some of the issues around domestic animals at that point. And linked into it, it sounds odd, but when you started to get free public visits to art galleries, the observation of images, including animal prints and etching through print shops, it does get to show you that people were looking at animals in different ways at that time.
Now that's really interesting. I think it was around that time that the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, now the RSPCA, was formed. So can you tell us anything more about that? And
I can, because I want to it's not that I'm ignoring what's happened around state institutions or Parliament, but there's another one that's an example that I'm not sure gets noticed that much. It's after the Martins Act, and it's a select committee run by William McKinnon. And what he wanted was people to give evidence about their own ordinary animals being taken, and he was trying to prevent the cruel and improper treatment of animals. Right. So he had examples of failed court cases, different people's accounts, An example, somebody called Thomas Young, who was a porter, carried sailors' hammocks and chests or did odd jobs, while he used to wonder where the cats went to, because he'd lost several. Also coming there would be Mr. Ewart, subsequently a vet, a lecturer, an expert on horses, also stated, as he later wrote, there is no domesticated animal, quadruped or fowl, to whom we do not owe something. So that aspect as well, bringing in other information becomes important, as well as you're rightly saying, the SPCA was established in 1824. But I think it's worth looking at some of the aspects of what the organisation was doing, because at least initially, I don't think it could be seen as an organisation in which there were key people implementing change. So it wasn't even until 1838 that there were even 2 inspectors in the SPCA who would be employed to help implement relevant legislation. It did rise a lot, certainly to 120 people, inspectors, in 1897. But it wasn't primarily lawyers who were active members in the SPCA, but various MPs and religious figures, including, as mentioned before, Thomas Fell Buxton, William Wilberforce, Sir James Mackintosh, and Reverend Arthur Broom, who was the vicar of St Mary's of Bromley by Bow, who became its secretary. And there were some religious aspects that were presented in many churches. And as Diana Donald has explained, its first meeting discussed the evident cruelties of the London streets, markets, and shambles. And one of the things that I think might get overlooked is a pamphlet they brought out. Now, this would be in 1829, when some legislation was passed. They put forward accounts of saving sheep, oxen, and calves, but they also drew attention to other animals. And one thing they noticed was frequently thrown into the Tower of London ditch, and they could see this through the nearby grating, was not just a question of cats falling carelessly into the drains, but that they were being appropriated and assigned to death. So many types of animals were there, cats of different sorts, appropriated and assigned to death. So it meant those that were owned and those that were strays. And what the SPCA claimed to do is to end that particular practice, writing that the recurrence of this evil has been prevented. And another example from that time that I recognise much later in an interesting way was they talked about the treatment of other creatures. And one phrase says, lobsters boiled and eels skinned alive, with an exclamation mark at the end. And my attention had been drawn to those comments actually in 1998 when I looked at an article in The Guardian, including an observation of a poster in Deal High Street. The journalist was entirely unaware of what these comments had been, and he stated in his article, lobster boiling is murder. Might seem an insane remark, but the Animal Liberation Front is the most successful terrorist movement Britain has known. So he was not even aware of such maltreatment of lobsters decades ago, and that was noticed by the SPCA.
And I think another really awful to read about, but really important issue of the day, and I know went on for longer, was this practice of skinning cats for their fur. So can you tell us a bit more about that and people's reactions to it at the time, whether people were indifferent to this happening or angry or accepting it?
Well, I'll tell you a bit about the background of it as well, because it's something that I don't think we generally know about.
No. Because
it wasn't a new thing happening in the 19th century, but nor were there previous attempts to stop it. For centuries in Britain, fur had been taken not just from rabbits, foxes and lambs, but also from cats. And knowledge of the work of cat skinners in London and beyond dates back to the late 14th century. But what has also been explored, not too much either, in 19th century state censuses, local postal directories or official maps, was the work of people who worked with animals around this time, such as horses outside many factories, or people collecting dog pure for purifying leather skins, or using cats to deter factory rodents. So it was them, as well as the noticing of cat skinners. And these were men and women who stole, killed, and personally removed the skins of many stray and owned cats. The cats were attacked late at night, outside the homes in which they lived, or in the area where they tended to sleep or move around. Their movement, particularly in evenings, meant that their skins were being quickly stripped from their bodies. Moreover, it would be female rather than male cats who would have their skins removed in this way. So not only did cat skinners believe that a live feline could be skinned more easily than a dead one, but allegedly furriers would only buy cat skin acquired in particular ways. So as a commenter noted, the furriers, if they bought a skin with blood all over, would say, "This is all a mess," and would not give so much for it by a halfpenny or a penny a skin. But it didn't affect the intrinsic value. So the police officers who were interviewed by McKinnon and his committee to describe their own observations, there was one, John Eastbrook, an officer in Wapping and Shadwell in East London. He explained the maltreatment of cats and dogs there. Knowing that 3 cats had been skinned nearby, Eastbrook continued his investigations to find out that the cat skins were likely to fetch from 6 shillings to 7 shillings a dozen, being the best skins for mock furs. So comments then started around this practice that differed between, say, different magistrates and aldermen and courts, both before and after the passing of what would be the Pieces Act in the 1930s. So if I could give you an example, this would be after the 1822 was passed. And this involves somebody called Theodore Cox. He's a bricklayer. And he'd lived just a few minutes away from the Smithfield area. And the previous night, Theodore had seen a woman called Mary Down come out of the local privy, go into the next yard and peered over. In her hands was a basket, and suspecting her purpose, he followed her. And he brought along assistance when she emerged with a cat half skinned and quite warm in her pocket. And it was because of Cox's work as a labourer, he was being constantly called upon to clear drains and privies. And these were obstructed by the bodies of skinned cats. And the neighbours had even pulled them up alive. So the watch inspector of St Sepulchres had previously held Mary Down twice before in custody for the same offence. At this point, it was Sir John Key, a magistrate at the Guildhall Magistrate Court, a former Lord Mayor and briefly MP for the City of London. And he asked specifically whether the cats were Mary's own animals. Obviously no. Key then asked whether she had apparently bought cats rather than cat skins, which she said were at the cost of 2 pennies and halfpence apiece from an unidentified man. And he was clearly hostile towards her. And he responded and said he asked how she would like a person to skin her while she was living. And at this point, the court was being advised that yesterday morning, a group of women had assembled, and they were so enraged at the unnecessary barbarity of the prisoner that it was an easy matter to save her from being skinned alive by them. And the session did end with Sir Key sending Mary Down to the House of Correction and hard labour for 2 months.
Oh gosh.
So you do get different. If I could give you another, well, I can talk to you then about the what happened with the Act, because when that was passed, it still meant that such activities were included. This would have been in 1835, when under Joseph Pearce, the Protection of Animals Act was passed, and it managed to secure many of these reforms that Martin had tried to introduce. And it did include cats and dogs and other domestic animals. It did include some opposition to animal baiting and cockfighting. It became sort of a national issue. And the things that were raised in 1835 were later expanded in 1849 in the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So it's from there that there also is other attention paid, I think.
Yeah, and what does your research reveal about the attitudes of the public to animals more generally?
I want, if it's okay with you, I'd like to just give you three different examples, because I don't think it's quite easy to just say, well, the law's there, they get sent down. I think it's more complicated than that. Not being a lawyer myself, right? After the Act, a woman called Elizabeth Rogerson was brought to court, and she had thrown away an empty sack which had 8 terribly mutilated cats, previously skinned alive, and they'd been down the water closet. Inside her rooms, PC Shaler found 8 or 10 dead cats in a saucepan, and he thought a quantity of their fat was for sale. Inside the flat was some brass collars and also 4 French live poodles. And for the moment, they were in excellent condition because they were eating the legs and shoulders of some cats' dead limbs placed before them. But in the magistrates' court, statements rather changed. Presenting evidence included a corn dealer from Tottenham Court Road who identified one of the sacks as his property. A woman from another square said she'd owned one of the collars from the neck of a favourite cat lost some time ago. And in brief, the older woman, Elizabeth Rogerson, was committed to prison for 2 months. But importantly, the police had kept constant watch on the house in St Pancras for fear that it might be pulled down by the mob. The magistrate, concerned for the lives of the poodles, instructed the constable to take charge of the dogs himself for the present and advertise them. And that was 20 years before the establishment of the Battersea Dogs Home, taking in lost London dogs. And the assumption was made that the former owners of the poodles would come forward, or that the police would then sell them to pay expenses. But no instructions were given to destroy the dogs. So the court proceedings ended with Elizabeth Rogerson being, and I quote, much hissed and hooted as she progressed from the lockup room to the official van, which took her to prison. So in the whole process, it wasn't just the police who seemed to take a stand, but the local witnesses, and beyond them, the crowd shouting hostility, threatening the home, etc. So I could see that as a case of ordinary people from different backgrounds expressing their own critical position against the maltreatment of domestic dogs. But another one I would refer to, which is done rather differently. This was in Bow Street Court. A man called John Jackson was charged with skinning live cats. And the main witness was a local woman called Jane Davis. And she lived in Whetstone Park, which was then a narrow passage between Lincoln's Inn Fields and what later became Holborn Viaduct. Looking out of her window at dusk, she saw the prisoner throw a large parcel on the dung heap in front of her house and run away. She called to some boys to stop and follow him, and he was shortly brought back by a police constable. The parcel was then opened, revealing the bodies of 4 cats who'd been skinned alive as they were quite warm. Now, although Jane Davis made no comment about her own cat or whether it was one of the 4 felines, however, she explained that dead cats were constantly being thrown upon the same heap. Thus, she was anxious to find out who the offenders were. So comments started to be made in other courts about witnesses describing their own cat, particularly if a collar was also found. But this wasn't the case here. It seems there was simply concern about such maltreatment. And as the PC explained, there were such repeated complaints in the neighbourhood. Somewhat unusually, the prisoner admitted the skinning and the selling of skins for threepence each in Petticoat Lane near the city, but said he found such cats lying dead in various parts of London. So clearly no information was given about acts occurring nearby, nor had anyone expressed actually seeing this skinning, but it was then thought that John Jackson could be indicted for stealing the cats. That is, through them being specifically owned. But the chief clerk observed that a cat was not recognised as, and I quote, a subject of larceny at common law. And it was only at this point that remarks were received from the RSPCA gentleman who had attended just to watch the case. And he said the society was fully aware of the prevalence of this revolting practice in London. Although some offenders had been punished, the RSPCA had difficulties because the inhuman monsters selected a time and place which rendered it impossible to obtain all the evidence. Therefore, the prisoner was discharged. So further, while the RSPCA officer made points about general punishment, it was the perspective of local people themselves who observed events regularly that appeared key in even getting the Skinner to court. And the last one on this I'd like to refer to, again, is things happening in a slightly different way. This one is in Worship Street in the city. And this is a man called James Glander, charged with skinning alive a number of cats. This legal action was not undertaken by the RSPCA, nor even the local police constables. This was by two boys who had seen the man turn a number of cats, skinned and still alive, out of a bag and dump them upon a heap of rubbish in Nova Scotia Gardens, which was near St Leonard's Church in Shoreditch. A further newspaper account described the comments of additional witnesses, and they included a butcher's porter, a wood chopper, and a fringe weaver. They were local working class people aware of the awful activities, not just commenting on cats being owned or not by them individually, but the general attack on cats. In addition to the younger boys, the adults also observed how Glander had removed the cats from his bag, and he was apparently, I quote, surrounded by 300 or 400 persons, some of them boys. After a few days, the cat Skinner was committed for 3 months by the magistrate, who also stated that it would really seem that there are others who, by purchasing animal skins obtained in this way, are as morally criminal as you. So I've looked at those court cases, and what I've tried to link it with a bit is also, I'll just briefly say, how people wrote about relationships to animals over time. So I'm coming across, say, Samuel Bamford, a chartist, who wrote about the political position of animals such as a dog, a steer, and a horse, understanding when they suffered outrage at the hands of ruthless man. Or Henry Mayhew, the social investigator, reporting the oral comments of people, including one who worked in a field making soldiers' trousers, but who took in a cat because somebody was poor to pay for the cat, and she pays him money, and what he will do is look after the cat every week because she begged him, and she had almost tears in her eyes in order for the man to take care of it, because she couldn't afford to give a meal she hadn't had for herself. She's a teacher of music, and I'm sure she's dying for want of food. So it's not just that I'm thinking about their court cases, it's people themselves writing accounts. And we tend to look, I think, it's good, but we often look at the published work. And I'm thinking, say, of Gordon Stables, lots of people, people will have read his things, always writes about dogs, which are very good, but he also writes about cats, and he writes about even, he says, they're systematically caught in thousands in every large town to be killed for their skins. And that is even in the 1880s. But on the other hand, there's a nice book called How to Keep a Cat in Health, which is as the century's turning around. And it's around cats supporting humans who are sick and bedridden. And if they do that, then they're described in this book, which I rather like, as angels in fur.
Oh.
But in the book, attention is also given to the advice they are saying must assist homeless and stray cats.
Oh, well, in relation to the skinning practices, did this stop as a result of legislation or public opinion, or was it a mixture of both?
It's, yeah, and I think you should be cautious, as it were, about was this ultimately stopping, because I've looked at in more detail in the book. There were several cases of cat maltreatment brought before the Pieces Act, but even with that passing, things were brought in not totally committed. So, for example, it wasn't even until 1839 that legislation was introduced preventing dogs from pulling carts, particularly within 15 miles of Charing Cross and longer. And so you've got political as well as legal positions continuing against cats and dogs. But even, I'm afraid, if you look onto the 20th century, there are still examples, say around cat skinning, and people think, oh, it's going to be the Protection of Animals Act of 1911, everything's hanky-dory. But for example, looking at, say, parliamentary reports during the Second World War, they are talking there about cat skinning still continuing.
Right.
So this idea that everything has changed and worked out, I don't think one can be quite clear about that.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating talking to you and getting a sense of the history of the time. Just a final question: do you think there are any lessons that we can learn today from this era, either inside or outside Parliament? Do you see any parallels with the struggle today for a more fair and just society for animals?
I don't think, I am not and never have been a lawyer, so I do not think that I can act in that way. But what I would argue, and I'll give some examples now, is I think by looking at some incidents that happen nowadays, one can look back not only to how the law was implemented before, but were people taking a stand at that point? What were they doing? So I think, and this has been quite widely publicised, so I'll try and say it in brief, that in 2021, somebody was imprisoned because of the acts against cats during 2018, 2019, and between 16 and 23 cats were killed or injured by one man in Brighton. Now, he was not caught just because of the acts of local police, but by local cat lovers. And this included a woman who was called Boudica Rising, coming from a campaign group. It was also a woman who'd owned previously a murdered cat and had set up a CCTV system to capture on camera the attacker, and she achieved this. Thus, Steve Bouquet, a security guard, was jailed for 5 years and 3 months in July 2021. And I think in language, it some ways recalled the works of the 19th century alderman. And this judge, Jeremy Gold, QC, said, it's important that everyone understands that cats are domestic pets, but they are more than that. They are effectively family members, which is very much what was said in the 19th century. But as the police have subsequently commented, more than 40 had been killed, but they couldn't build up this case. And the emphasis was on, in their words, criminal damage, suggesting in some ways, like earlier times in which owned cats were initially seen to be more important than strays. And Bouquet never admitted these acts, and he did die through cancer in January 2022. So this was, I think, well covered in the press, but it did seem to suggest that activity was entirely new. Whereas my view would be the acts of people in the 19th century who dragged killers to the police to arrest them, gave statements in court, ran demonstrations, physically threatened them, seemed much more in place in some ways now, but it was also in place and in a variety of ways in the 19th century. I think similarly a case looking at it in a very different way is the sentence against West Ham French footballer Kurt Zouma and his brother Ewan. And this was quite minimal on the BBC when it finally came out on June the 1st. And it was simply, he was given 180 community hours, his brother 140 hours, and a fine of just under £9,000 in court. Although 250,000 were already taken off him by his football club, West Ham. And they said, which I think is important to note, "We condemn in the strongest terms any form of animal abuse or cruelty, and not in line with the values of the football club." And more importantly, in a way, it gave the 250,000 to animal charities. Mm. Now, again, here you had the judge. This one was Susan Holden. And she said that Zouma particularly should have protected the cat's needs. But as some press items did indicate, there were other reminders. Zouma's son was asked to hold one of the Bengal cats as his father slapped its head. Now, that was a totally different stance to the action taken by two boys in Shoreditch we've just stated. Further, as a prosecutor stated, the matter came to light when a young lady had been chatting to Zouen and then rejected seeing him that evening because of his vile action. And again, that's good, but I would also recall the reports of female and male witnesses in the 19th century courts. So I think we need to explicitly acknowledge previous opposition and to not just consider negative cruelty to animals as something new under contemporary and even pandemic times. By recognising the past, we can also think clearly about legal changes that evidently are still clearly needed 200 years on from the Martins Act. Now, I am sure that the conference will discuss this. As a historian, I too have tried to reflect on past times, say like Animals in the Blitz in The Great Cat and Dog Massacre, my book with the University of Chicago Press, which was also, again, often overlooked by many historians. And similarly, as in the 19th century, it was again individuals who'd written about dogs and cats in the war and passed these on to descendants. I think that a past historical memory, albeit negative as well as positive, is still needed to really understand and defend animals today.
Oh, thank you so much. I've learned so much that I was completely unaware of, and I'm sure it's going to be of great interest to our listeners. I should just add in relation to the Kurt Zouma case that the £9,000 referred to was an award of costs and was not the actual penalty, which was 180 hours of community service. And both cats have now been safely rehomed. So thank you for your time today. It's been really, really enjoyable talking to you.
Thank you for asking me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Talking Animal Law. It's been a real pleasure talking to Hilda Keane today, and we look forward to marking the anniversary of Martins Act passed 200 years ago. If you like this episode, please subscribe to this podcast on your favourite platform and keep up to date with current issues in animal law, ethics and policy. We'll be back in another 2 weeks to bring you further episode of Talking Animal Law. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from. And if you give us a good review, it will help others to find us. And don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss a show.
For more information about the work of the UK Centre for Animal Law, please go to www.alaw.org.uk.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's iroarpod.com.